how in your campaign do you think you will help facilitate that shift?
Yeah, great. That's a very useful conversation to have as we, because the time right before elections is the time that change becomes possible where it might not have been before. So yeah, so talking with my City of Sydney Council hat on, I think I know everybody. For anyone who might be looking on the recording, I'm Greens councillor on the City of Sydney. We've got 1 out of 10 at the moment on the council, and I'm the chair of the Housing for All working group. And one of the things that we've been trying to, as Action for Public Housing has as well, move the council to do, is to start building and buying and co-investing in housing again. It was something that we as the Greens launched a costed initiative, I think it was 3 years ago before the last election, looking at how much money council has, saying, look, you know, if you directly invested this in the community, you could even do it in a way that was sustainable, but it would need to be done a little bit differently from before. You should look at co-investing with the community. You know, if there are groups that want to form co-ops or collectives of older women who want to form housing, or you should be directly buying housing that's at risk of being lost, like boarding houses. The council could offer rent-controlled homes, some of them that are low income, as long as there were some that were more kind of middle or average income. You could make enough money from that you could reinvest it back and the council could grow more housing. So it has been a pretty big focus over the last 2 years of the Greens work on council, this particular council, to try and make that idea seem more possible. Some of you were at the talk that we organised with Paul Karakosevic, I'm going to get his name wrong, Paul Karakosevic. Ian can correct me, or Marie can correct me, it's Polish, I got that wrong. But talking about what they do in London, where like here, they had very much, the public housing departments of local councils had been smashed by neoliberalism, and that by conservative governments at all levels. And part of what that did was really de-skill the council. Not only did it force it to get rid of the housing stock that it had, it removed the ability of the council to know how to build and control and be a landlord again. So even when the political will came back amongst the elected council, and this was Labor left, I guess, with some Greens and minority council saying, we want to do this again. We want to build up our housing stock again. We want to be the ones who are in charge of it. We want to buy back the homes that were sold under Thatcher. They face real challenges in being able to do it quickly, because you need to have the capacity within your public service as a council to do that. The money was less of an issue because they were willing to borrow and say, we're going to pay it off over 30 years. We will work with our community. We'll have a mix of locals in there. We'll have low income. They have something called London Living Rent, which is basically rent capped based on 30% of the average full-time worker in the whole of London's income. They have a mix, means the communities have a greater diversity, but it also means they have a bit more money to fund their housing. And then over the last 10 years, but particularly the last 7 years, they've been able to build up again. So we were trying to talk a bit about that, trying to look at some of the modelling which we have shared with the council staff and the other councillors. How is it that European countries have, on average, 20% public or not-for-profit housing, social, but none of us like that term, right? And we in Australia have such a tiny percentage. We actually have quite a lot here in the City of Sydney compared to other local government areas, but it's going backwards. So we spent a lot of time trying to normalise that idea, sharing reports, doing talks, putting motions up through council. And it is interesting in terms of the politics of what's possible, that we've seen a real shift amongst all the other councillors except for the Clevermore Independent Party, which remains very committed to the idea that it is not council's responsibility to housing anymore, that was something that was done 30 years ago. The state government at that time took the housing off council, started to sell it or made it all public housing and then ran it down. It's not council's job anymore. It's now, I think Labor also has a platform, obviously the Socialist Alliance does as well, to be reinvesting and building that housing. We've even had some positive responses from, if you can believe it, the Liberal councillors at times around this. And we're getting a lot of really positive responses when we talk to the community about it. They don't understand why the council doesn't see it as its job to do everything it can, and also doesn't see why it isn't council's job when council used to do it. And when our neighbouring councils do it on a small scale. Inner West Council owns housing. and it gives it to a community housing provider to run it because they don't have their own tenancy. Yeah, but they own that housing and they're trying to grow that housing, and they are planning to redevelop car parks, which will stay in council hands to deliver more housing. Randwick Council's doing it. Waverley Council's been doing it for a long time. Canada Bay, I'm just doing the councils that are around us, have just put out a discussion paper to ask residents, would you like us as a council to start building housing? So there's a real shift in the community around this, but unfortunately, until the current Lord Mayor goes, I'm not optimistic about our chances to move the large amounts of money that the City of Sydney has very far. So that's your question?
Yeah. Like, it's crazy to me to think that, you have Clover standing there, like, she's been in there for so long and she's just hoarding like the money like some sort of wealth dragon. It's really weird. Like, it's strange times, certainly, and getting, Clover to read the room or find out will be quite interesting. Ian.
Sylvie, the Sydney is, a wonderful and complex city where full of character and opportunities for new development, but it has to be very carefully tailored. And the state government isn't very good at that. And so do you see this as an opportunity for council to pick some areas as exemplars where they can demonstrate how you can insert new density into mature suburbs and do it in a way which works?
So, yeah, I think there is a particular moment in time right now to have the conversation that you as Action Public Housing have been having and others about renovate, don't demolish. There's also a bigger issue, I think, that Ian is alluding to here, about that the approach of all development in the city and other places tends to be, let's knock it down and do new things, as opposed to it's more difficult often and requires more sensitivity and more talking to the local community to sustainably infill and renovate and say, this is how it can be done. You can have the density that you want without breaking up the community. You can keep what is important to you and what is beautiful architecturally or whatever, but also it's much less disruptive often in the lives of the people who already live there, right? I think there is a real moment where particularly the residents groups that care about issues like heritage are starting to align with groups trying to defend affordable and public housing. And we all know that there's sort of waves of that being those groups together and then seeing themselves as separate. But there certainly seems to be, when I'm talking to groups, I think, did the Potts Point Preservation Society come and talk to you, Ian? Is this partly why you're asking this question? I told them to come and talk to you about their preservation activities, and I'm like,
they did talk to me.
Like Ian and Cleve.
They did talk to me, and it was an interesting conversation.
Sorry.
Because we have a lot in common, and yet we're quite different.
Interesting.
We're frozen. But yeah, look, I think there's an interesting campaigns are won because of broad coalitions. And I think there's a particularly interesting moment to organise groups that might once have been, hey, we don't want to, we're going to focus on prioritising protecting heritage to the exclusion of others, if that's the kind of kindest way to do it, who are saying, and now moving into, no, we want our city to grow, but we want it to be done in a sensitive way. And a coalition of groups that are on the same page together about doing development and density differently. I think there's an interesting opportunity right now.
Fascinating. Okay, Moira. And after that, Rach, be nice.
Okay, so yes, it's interesting the way the public perception and the activity that groups are doing is actually starting to shifting because of the housing crisis, as they call it. Not that it's been building for decades, ever since Greiner said the government is no longer going to be involved as a developer in the public interest, the market. So the market determines everything. And of course, Land and Housing Corporation is still not getting much money from the government. But it's interesting how the idea of leaving it to the market has brought such a catastrophe. And I think it's really important to start pushing and advocating to the state government, and this is for all councils to do that, to the state government via the local members and so on, to actually say the state government must intervene as a developer in the public interest once more. I think that's really important, rather than leaving it up to councils, because councils are not in the best position to actually pay for and build the assets. They really need the state government to be involved in that as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Translated, you know, you can also talk the talk while you walk the walk to the state government.
Yeah, and I do think it's part of this is where we want to go if we all move in the right direction. So the discussion about starting a public developer at the federal level, or in some of the states where, like, the Greens have just announced a costed plan around that. But it's not something you can do instantly. There's even having a conversation about that, I think, moves us to a discussion about how much we demand of developers if they're developing public land, for example. So in London, they're developing a public developer. They don't have one yet, but instead of saying, like, what we do here is we tend to give a private developer the whole chunk of land and say, you can have a third of it, or you can have half of it, or you can have 70% of it. And they get to keep all the profit of that, as opposed to saying, we'll commission you to develop it and you'll get a fee, a certain scale of fee. And at the end of it, you'll get the number of apartments that we need to meet our fee of what it actually cost you. And so one of the examples in the lecture was where the public housing tenants had worked out, they got their land redeveloped and they had to have one tower that was private development. They're like, right, okay, 20%, one tower. We'll design it though. We want to make it look the way that we want it to be on our estate. They did that, and in the end they sold the apartments off because the council kept control of the whole process. It sold them off. It didn't just give that bit of land to the developer. They sold it for more money, and then they didn't have to sell as many of the apartments, and they kept some of them, and now there's public housing in the tower as well, because by keeping control of all the bits, you can make sure that none of the profit leaks out. So I think there's steps between letting the market do whatever the hell it wants and just giving it land if you want something redeveloped and trying to get a bit back at the end, and a public developer. There's things in the middle that are about the state and council having much stronger control to keep all the profits if we do need to be redeveloping public land, is what I say. That's very technical. Sorry, it's about how we get these wheels will take a long time to change, and on council you often get to govern as the left in a way you don't in other spaces, and so it's useful to have a practical conversation about steps that take us where we want to be.
Yeah, sorry. You're absolutely right. I mean, councils are doing what they can do over time, but the state government really needs to step in again, because the statement in 88 that let everything to the market, we've ended up with a disaster. So they need to come in with whatever is needed, whether they become a developer, but in particular regulations, make commercial agreements, etc., etc. They need to come in and do all of that, rather than saying, oh my God, we've got to give them every incentive we can possibly can, lift every rule in town and see if they'll do something. And what do? They do the paperwork, but they don't actually build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think one of the problems, with Treasury and that sort of thing, in the state government is that the dweebs, they're not very smart. They just got really into like urban planning and that sort of thing, and they think they're the heroes, which is a bit sad. But yeah, that's what you get when you get a bunch of bean counters trying to dictate housing, which is a market they probably will never understand. Anyway.
Especially, sorry, last thing I'm going to say, especially related to what you're saying, Siobhan, especially when the Treasury rules about profit making is a requirement still. That needs to change.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, Sylvie just put in the chat something. You can say that out loud if you want, but yeah. Okay. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It's sort of like yeah. they'll get it eventually, but it may be a new generation. But yeah, let's
I think Rachel, did you say that you had a question? Was that earlier, Rachel? Or
oh, Rachel. Yeah, Rachel. Yeah, sorry, Rach. Yeah. Sorry, sharing.
You're on mute, mate.
Thanks heaps, Sylvie, for coming along. And yeah, it's been interesting reading your very good report that you launched a year and a half ago about London and Paris. And I'm just wondering if you'd comment on three things. One is it 800 million or $1 billion in the coffers? And also, can you explain how undemocratic and untransparent the council is, in that it's impossible to find out that they have $800 million in the bank account unless you know people like you who keep telling us. The developer levy is really low. And you were saying in the report, I think, that it's between 15 to 30% in Paris or London. And so in Sydney, Council Sydney has it's 1 to 3% of a developer levy. They've made 400 million or something, you were saying, from that developer levy since mid-2021. And so if you could explain that a little bit to us, because I think that's a way that we can put the pressure on to tax the rich, i.e. Clover Moore to tax the rich, or whoever gets in. The other thing is the affordable housing, 80% of your income on rent is not affordable. Is that what they're defining as affordable? That's something we really do need to hone in on as activists, because, yeah, 80% of market rent, because the only announcement that Clover Moore and the state government have made in the city of Sydney in terms of their big build is North Everleigh, and that's 250 social and affordable homes out of 500. That's the only thing they're offering at the moment, which is pretty paltry. But if it's like, 170 affordable homes at 80% market rent, that's not great. That's really quite shit. So the other question I have, just to comment, Clover Moore keeps talking about these stakeholders, and she throws in the CHPs and Newtown Neighbourhood Centre as the groups that she wants to meet whenever she gets pressured on Selwyn Street, the boarding houses, or anything to do with housing. She goes, quick, let's have a meeting with the stakeholders. Maybe what we need to think about as Action for Public Housing, in line with the resident action groups, is developing a log of claim to council, which would include an increased developer levy and housing co-ops to counter the money that's going to the CHPs. And just a final thing, Selwyn Street, how do we get the boarding houses saved? That's it.
That wasn't three questions, Rachel. That's okay. 3.5, 3 3/4.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah, it's been a long 12 months.
So just to be clear, the amount of money that the council has in the bank, you can go to tonight's committee meeting. I'll drop the link in. Every month we get an update about how much we've got in the bank. And this is separate. It's like, you have your money that you have to spend every year, your budget, and you may make more than you spend. The bank money is this bit that is used to invest. You can spend it or you can keep it there and you can get more interest. Some of it you can't spend because we have to keep some of it for, like, superannuation for workers, or because it's a developer contribution and we can only spend it on affordable housing. So there's 750 million in the bank, and about 500 million of it could be spent on what the council chooses, because it isn't committed to something else.
So
there's surplus, and then there's like
possibilities?
spare cash that is currently being used to make interest. So it's invested. You could buy houses with it. You could buy commercial property with it. You keep it in the bank and get the interest. But in the sense of, that's what the council's choosing to do with most of it. But in the sense that it's unlike other councils that are often in the red, the City of Sydney runs enough money every year, so it's always got a little bit left over, and it now has a nest egg. A nest egg is the best way to describe that money. And the exact amounts, I'll drop the link in the chat, but we get a report every month. Sorry, my dog's going to be barky.
Literally taking the idea of running the thing like a household. Like, where's the retirement? Are they planning on going to Tahiti?
So they say it's needed to fix our footpaths over the next 10 years, etc. I don't agree with Marie's. That's not my understanding of the restrictions on the reserves, but I'll drop some reports in the chat and I just might keep moving on to Rachel's next two questions were about how do we define affordable housing? The council currently defines it as 30% of your income. So the state government is playing a bit of silly buggers and is keeping grey when it says it uses the word affordable housing in a media release or about somewhere like North Everleigh. It doesn't necessarily tell you what kind of affordable they mean. So, but I can tell you in terms of the council's money, and we say we used it to give it to a CHP to build some, it has to be that definition of 30% of a low income, that no more than 30%. It's the
I've got a question on that, if that's okay. Is there strict definitions on like longevity, right? We know there's examples of like you put out a like affordable house and it's only there for like 5 years and then it goes back to being, you know, unaffordable, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the answer is councils aren't required to pick a particular definition of affordable housing. They can define it and put it in their policy. So for example, Willoughby Council has some affordable housing for key workers only, and it sets it at that rate. Some councils do it for short periods of time. The City of Sydney has chosen in its policy to write a definition that says it must be permanent, good, and it must be no more than 30% of your income. So I think we've got the good definition, but when it comes to all the other definitions around, it looks like it's all different because it's all different and they spin it different ways. So sorry, Rach, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I can tell you what our council policy is. Yeah. How much do we charge developers? Okay, so City of Sydney charges 1% on all the commercial development over a certain size and 3% on all the residential. It's like a flat tax, and they collect it and then they give it to a community housing provider. That we are trying to get them to keep it and build our own housing. We haven't won that one yet, or keep it and use it to buy boarding houses. But that's currently what happens. Cities like London have a 30% minimum on new housing, and Paris, it's 50% minimum on public land. But they do have some switch offs, which are a bit like they'll let the developer come and say, you can't charge me that much. Sorry. That's my other dog, Nugget. It's a bit barky. They have some outs that let the developer say things like, if you charge me that much, my development will be unviable. So it's not super black and white, but I still think it's completely legit to go, there's a huge gap between a 1% and 3% and a 30%. And there's also a bit of stuff about, are you just renovating your building and not building anymore, or are you adding lots of height with rezoning? We should definitely be grabbing at least 30% when we make a building taller or worth more money because we've rezoned it. Then we should be saying, well, we just created some wealth for you with our pen by rezoning something. We let you privatize what this airspace and ability to, you know, that would otherwise, we've given it off as a one chance only. We should be grabbing much more of that and putting it into the public pocket. So the Greens' position is that it needs to be a minimum of 30%. That's what we're arguing for. And we've not been able to get any movement on that so far.
Which is weird because, you know, considering they're just like hoarding wealth, like wealth dragons, why am I using that analogy? Why don't they just go for it, you know? Anyway, yeah.
Karen had a question, and then there's one more on boarding houses if you're not sick of me yet, and I'm happy to answer it.
Yeah, boarding houses actually at Selwyn Street. I believe there's 32 people living in those boarding houses, and they'll be replaced by flats that will house about 8 people. Now we had someone here from council not long ago in the factory who said that the council said that there's to be no more than 15% decrease when demolition and rebuild happens, but that seems to be a lot more than 15% decrease in density. So what's the story there?
Good, lots of technical planning questions. Okay, we have passed rules. Actually, I moved them and the council supported them. The Waverley Council's doing the same thing, where we're calling them no net dwelling loss. That's very sexy, isn't it? They're out on exhibition at the moment, and that's for the older apartment blocks that are getting gutted by developers to make luxury ones. They tend to go, oh, I can't make enough money out of these little old apartments, so I'll buy a block and I'll gut them all and make a couple of mega apartments, or I'll take a boarding house and I'll gut it and make it into one big palatial mansion for me. So those rules are on exhibition. We're trying to get them passed, but we know the property industry is organising to try and block them. They've already convinced the state government to take the council as not the decision maker when they come back, and it'll be the state government that decides whether these rules get adopted into our LEP. I found out, I put a GIPA application in to try and get a copy of the correspondence, but that's been confirmed for me. The problem with boarding houses is that they have their own special set of rules, a SEP, that means we don't get to decide through the way we would normally development on council. It's over here through the boarding house rules under the housing SEP. So unfortunately, those protections we want to put on over here, we can't legally get them to apply to the boarding house. We have to follow the boarding house rules. Now, those boarding house rules are very weak, and one of the things we need to do is to strengthen the planning rules to protect those boarding houses from being lost. It's 30 people, but with 32 rooms, so they could house 32 people in Selwyn Street. And yes, they do plan to subdivide it, make a couple of big swanky terraces with stacked luxury car parks in the back where people used to live, because that seems like a good use of inner city land. Yeah, but ultimately the way that these houses need to be protected, the boarding houses, is the council or a not-for-profit needs to buy them, and that's what the community campaign is. That's really going to be difficult, because even if there are good planning rules, like we've lost like 500 boarding houses in 10 years and we've had 14 DAs. So that tells you they're just changing them into normal housing and they're not telling anyone through a planning instrument, and nobody's checking. So the rules are important, but I think ultimately we need to, as you would, I'm sure would agree, a council, or we need to permanently protect them by taking them out of the private market.
Okay, Andrew.
Quick question, Sylvie. If council owned and operated its own council housing, would the tenants be eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance?
No, they did not. So one of the reasons councils can't do as much, and actually it's one of the reasons that the state government and Treasury was so supportive of council getting rid of all of its public housing and giving it to CHPs. The CHPs get all these federal subsidies that they just don't give the state government. And in fact, the way that it works in Paris and London and stuff is the federal government helps out the local councils more with those kinds of subsidies. So there's a structural discrimination against public housing that is by the federal government, and I think that's something we need to change, because it's an important source of keeping public housing sustainable. See, the idea that a not-for-profit can get a subsidy to give affordable housing, but the public system can't get that same federal subsidy. Yeah, it's one of the reasons that really helped encourage Treasury to. Sorry, that's the Selwyn Street guys. I'll call them back after. Yeah, that's one of the reasons that everyone was so eager in the state government to transfer all their housing to out of there, because they're like, well, you'll be able to make it more sustainable than us, because the feds will give you money that they won't give us, is one of the reasons.
Howard.
You're like a school student. I'm being discriminated against.
CHP for no what? What's the rent assistance thing?
Commonwealth Rent Assistance.
CRS.
CRS for all. It's just what? Why aren't we giving CRS for the public housing people, right? That's
Yep. So CHPs are subsidised by the federal government. So are private landlords subsidised by the federal government, whether it's in negative gearing or the they get Commonwealth Rent Assistance as well.
Nice on me.
Everyone else gets it, but not me.
We have modelled it that it would be possible for council to sustainably do that without rent assistance, because we've got enough cash to start with, but you would have to put more middle income people in the mix to get enough rent. Basically, that's
it's bigger than just Sydney Council, right? I mean, this is councils all over Australia, right? We've got some people from Wagga, right? So, if we're going to push the feds on that, that might be something to consider in the horse trading, as a council. Now, interesting.
I think Virginia's got her hand up, but I think we've taken much longer than this.
Yeah.
You might have wanted for all
Yeah.
decided,
Virginia,
guys.
I think Sylvie, you're very nice, but I think this is probably should be the final question because you've got stuff to do.
I'll just unmute myself.
No, just muted myself.
Are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thanks, Sylvia. Sylvia, I beg your pardon. We have one Greens councillor on Wagga City Council, Jenny McKinnon, who's going for re-election. And I did ask her about, I just wanted to double check I've got my facts right. What you said earlier about, she said that the council's argument about, this is Wagga Council, when she put it to the manager about investing in housing was that, the state government would come along and take it away from us because that's what they did. So could you just reiterate that again? Just said
Oh, yeah. So the historically, what happened was the state government forced councils, or a lot of councils, to transfer their public housing that the councils had built and owned over to the state government. I think it was for $1. I remember no more about this. And they didn't have a choice in the matter, and then they proceeded to start flogging a lot of it off. And so it's live in the memory of people who've been around for a very long time, but I would also argue it was last century, and perhaps we should get over it and look forward to what the situation is now.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for that.
And Alistair's about to nick off, so maybe we should.
Hey, let's just get Alistair on because he's got to leave. So, Siobhan, how